right. Well, I'm really glad to be presenting so soon after that keynote, because a lot of the ideas that she talked about the materials as teachers, and what was the other thing? I was like, yes, that's what I do. Materials as teachers, and how the wool encodes aspects of the landscapes is very much also present in the work that I've been doing. So my talk is about shepherds and shawls making place in the Western Himalayas. And but in research, as in the mountains, the route from A to B is rarely a straight line, even when someone points the way and tells you, "See they Jiao." So even though I titled this presentation Shepherds and Shawls, it's actually going to go in reverse order. Although the shawls were my entry point into this work, my encounters with shepherds led me in some other directions, and so I'll take you on some of those paths today. So the shawl of the title is the Kulu shawl, which here represents the state of Himachal Pradesh in northern India, where I recently spent 10 months researching wool production. And I have a couple samples, I'll pass them around, and I need them back at the end. So this map, so Himachal is a small state, but it has a lot of geographic and cultural diversity. It spans from the Punjab plains through sort of these parallel mountain chains of the Himalayas and into the Tibetan plateau on the other side. So this map happened to come across my Facebook feed the day after I arrived at my host institution, and I almost reposted it with some note like, "Greetings from the middle of Kulu shawls." But although I was in the middle of Himachal, I wasn't in an area where that particular shawl is woven or typically worn, although it was for sale in the tourist shops. So it occurred to me that this map, as beautiful as it is, expresses the very assumptions that I was hoping to counter in my research, as it presents textile practices as timeless traditions and actually obscures diversity across both space and time. So by choosing a single handloom product to represent each state, the map renders other textile traditions within and crossing state borders or state boundaries invisible. For example, in Himachal, there are other types of shawls, such as this type, I'll pass this sample around, which is commonly woven and worn by men in Kangra, where I conducted most of my research. The format of the map also freezes the textiles presented within political boundaries, state and national, as they happen to be drawn at a particular time and by particular political actors. Some of these borders, especially in the Himalayan and trans-Himalayan regions, are contested. Despite the inclusion of some historical context within the state descriptions, the map overall presents its textiles within the ethnographic present as static traditions. So my research instead explores material and making through dynamic collaborations with folks who work with wool. I don't say artisans because many of the people who I work with would not identify themselves as that. So what brought me to Himachal were questions around this statement of the types of wool that go into a Kulu shawl: merino, angora, and local sheep wool. I had spent some time in Kulu Valley before, learning from a shawl weaver, so I knew that she and other weavers typically work with yarns that are milled in Ludhiana, an industrial textile production center in the plains, from wool that is mostly imported. And in the shops, if you want to buy yarn for knitting, all that's available are synthetic yarns. So I wanted to know what was the story with the local wool, and what's the potential for getting it into the local textile production systems. But something else interesting is happening in this statement, and that really ended up becoming the focus of my research. So the term local is included in this list alongside breeds of fiber animals, merino sheep and angora rabbits, implying that local is not merely a geographic designation, and in fact is some way related to breed. So most industry discourse and interventions center on breeding for improved, quote-unquote, wool. This is certainly true in Himachal as well. In the 1970s, the government began importing fine wool sheep like merino for a crossbreeding program. And the dominant narrative is that at this point, there are no pure native breed sheep left. But it turns out when you hang out with shepherds for a while, they'll start to point out sheep that they identify as desi, native or local, in contrast to other sheep, which they variously identify as cross, Merini, or Australia. So I don't have time to get into the complexities of breed here, but I do want to note that in using the term desi, I'm not making any claims about the breeding histories or genetics of these sheep. Rather, I use it to attend to certain characteristics of the wool and of the sheep, which are valued within local networks of use and exchange, and which I'll argue express some aspects of place in particularly interesting ways. So what are those characteristics? The one I'll be focusing on here is double-coatedness, the presence of two distinct types of fiber within the fleece of a single sheep, one long, relatively coarse and low print, and one that is shorter, finer, and crimpier. And I have samples of that too. So feel free to take a little tuft and play around with it. This is a multi-sensory presentation. So commodity wool production is geared primarily toward attaining as much uniformity within the material as possible, and double-coated wool is anything but uniform. But it does have some useful properties, for example, felting really well into a thick weatherproof fabric. I'll come back to that thought, but first I want to take a little theoretical detour through the material. So I find wool useful in thinking about place because wool is quite directly a manifestation of place. Sheep eat the grasses and other plants of the landscape and metabolize it into wool. So wool embodies place, but equally, I would argue that wool embodies time. As each strand of wool grows out from the sheep's skin, it becomes, in effect, a record of the sheep's experiences in the time between shearings. In most production systems worldwide, once a year, but in Himachal, typically every 6 months, and even 3 times a year, with 1 long and 2 short growing seasons. Wool also expresses time differentially. It doesn't always grow at the same rate. Factors like nutrition and day length can affect the speed of growth, and different breeds of sheep are more or less sensitive to those changes. And in the case of double-coated wool, there are 2 timescales expressed side by side within the same fleece. This has some practical implications, for example, in devising a wool sampling protocol that will yield scientifically rigorous results. It's going to be hard. But what I'm really interested in is a theoretical exploration of this wool, this double-coated desi wool, as a materialization of the polyrhythms of agripastoral life in Himachal. So art historian Rebecca Brown develops a polyrhythmic theory of time in analyzing visual records of colonial-era Indian craft production, proposing a time that returns but not always to repeat, that takes on patterns from a range of sources and brings them together into a moving, action-filled, layered polyrhythmic temporality. Brown's polyrhythmic time calls in temporal terms for attention to the same concerns expressed spatially in the deep local and contact zones invoked in the theme of this symposium. I began thinking about the rhythms of Himachali life while learning Pahari folk songs. A common rhythm in these songs pairs long and short pulses in combinations of 2s and 3s, something like this. So it was like da, 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 right? So this rhythm put me in mind of the agricultural cycles of the main subsistence crops in the region, rice and wheat, which are planted in the same fields in succession, but not in exactly 6-month intervals. It's a little syncopated. That basic rhythm is overlaid with cycles of other crops and seasons, tea, tourism, and of course, wool and migratory herding. Herding itself encompasses multiple rhythms of movement across the landscape. Some herders migrate for 3 months, others for 6 months, some for the whole year, stopping at home only for a month or so twice a year. Brown situates the paintings that she analyzes within the temporalities of the craft actions depicted and the circulation of the paintings as collectors purchased and displayed them. Temporalities of wool production could include the timescales of wool growth, of washing, carding, spinning, and weaving wool, of circulation of finished items through time-bound rituals of gifting within communities and through sales to tourists who visit seasonally, and of lifespans of use and repair. Movements within these phases echo each other. The movements of sheep crossing the parallel mountain chains in the back and forth of seasonal migration, of the spinner's hand winding yarn onto the charka and drafting the roving back, of the weaver's shuttle passing the weft back and forth across parallel warp ends, and of the finished cloth in shawl or blanket or jacket form, once again moving along the herding routes, no longer on the bodies of the sheep, but on the bodies of the herders. If desi wool is a material expression of these polyrhythms of Pahari life, then the crossbreeding program could be read as part of a project to impose the monorhythm of industrial time onto rural mountain communities. One government official even suggested to me that herders should move to a once-yearly shearing, which would work fine for the improved sheep that only have a single coat of wool, but would result in unusably long BC wool. So the sample that's going around now, that's a 6-month growth, and it's quite long. So I want to end with an anecdote that offers some suggestions on how theoretical attention to polyrhythms could play out in practice and can inform craft interventions seeking to strengthen local economies. I mentioned before that one property of double-coated wool is its ability to felt. Herding communities make use of this property through mandai, by which woven cloth and bundles of spun yarn are transformed into thick, weatherproof fabric and sturdy cord. These in turn are stitched into blankets and garments which herders rely on for survival as they move through rugged terrain in harsh and variable weather conditions. So when members of a village self-help group asked me to help them develop wool products for sale, I considered how to adapt these rugged textiles that communities make for their own use into something that would be more marketable to non-herding consumers. So I thought, let's make felt, which would be similar to existing practices, but would reduce the amount of time and labor going into the finished products because you're going directly from carded wool to finished fabric. So it would be easy to frame the work that I did with this group as skills training, but I prefer to think of it as collaboration in anthropologist Anna Singh's formulation as transformation through encounter. Like polyrhythms, collaborations bring together bits from various sources in ever-shifting patterns that are not necessarily predetermined. Training is an event that exists within progressive linear time. Before the training, participants do not possess a skill, and after the training, they do. Training also places me, a white, economically privileged foreigner, in a position of authority over the rural women attending the training, who are positioned as lacking in some way. So I resist the training frame, which is good because as a training, the project was not super successful. I happened to arrive for the follow-up session when women were busy getting the wheat harvested between unusually early pre-monsoon rains, so few could take time to work with me. And we also found out that the nearby wool mill only operates seasonally, so we couldn't get our fleeces carted there. And somehow no one had the owner's phone number, so we couldn't even try to get in and use it. Formative collaborative encounter, the work was enormously productive. While a few of us worked, about half the village passed by and stopped to see what we were doing. Some commented on the proceedings, sharing their own knowledge of mandai and of uses of wool which had fallen out of practice with the introduction of cheap manufactured goods, such as plastic flip-flops and foam camping pads for sitting on. Many villagers expressed interest in learning to felt themselves, mostly to make slippers and seat cushions for their own use. The process mixed traditional and modern materials and practices in unplanned ways. For example, we used broken flip-flops as molds for felting wool slippers, which prompted one participant to create a model of a shoe that used to be common. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong. Hang on. Well, okay, I clicked too far ahead. Prompted one participant to create a model of a type of shoe that used to be commonly made out of bits of wool cloth. So I also learned that felting and mandai are less similar than I had presumed. The motions are the same, but the physical experience of performing them is quite different. In felting, you have to start gently to keep the fibers from shifting out of place before they begin to cohere. In mandai, women apply lots of force right away, using their feet there and their whole body weight. So when I was demonstrating felting, I would start by working the material with my hands, which for me is less forceful than using my feet. But my collaborators would just really get into it. And as you can see in the picture of the slippers, it didn't always work out so well. One of them's it's a little abstract and artistic. So I came to see the motions of felting as akin not only to mandai, but to other tasks within the polyrhythms of women's domestic and agricultural work, the daily kneading of dough for chapati, weekly washing of laundry in the stream, and annual processing of tea leaves, all of which involve application of considerable force. Practicing these skills myself taught me more about life in that place, but it also taught me more about felting. So one more feature of Singh's collaborative encounters is that they're indeterminate. Their outcomes are not defined in advance, nor is it easy to delineate their boundaries. So it's difficult to decide when, or even if, this felting encounter ended. After a week of playing with wool, I accompanied one of the village leaders to a meeting of the Gumantu Pashupalak Mahasabha, an activist group of herders from multiple ethnic, caste, and religious communities across the state. The felt pieces that we brought to display catalyzed conversation with many of the herders, including some who questioned my intentions as a researcher very validly. Those conversations led to invitations to other villages to do felting, and the collaborations that formed through mutual encounters with wool continue to unfold. The polyrhythms in which I immersed myself while making place with my Pahari friends also pulse through the writing of this representation of place for you today. A lot of these ideas coalesced quite suddenly after I'd been working on it for a while without making much headway. It was a bit like making felt, feeling it suddenly shift from a mess of unruly strands going every which way to a single mass. Still an unruly tangle, but starting to cohere. Coincidentally, this happened on the date of Ser, a Kangri holiday marking multiple seasonal transitions, the end of monsoon, survival of the rice crop, which will be harvested in about a month, and the beginning of shearing season. So I want to end by saying to all of my collaborators and to you as well as collaborators in this continuing process, thank you for being my companions on this sort of open-ended encounter, and I wish you a happy Ser.